The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
I was born and raised in Grand Falls, in town, although I spent a lot of time on the farm because both grandparents were involved there. It was uneventful as a teenager, going through playing basketball in high school and who's coaching but the local constabulary. The RCMP members would come in. And it was kind of exciting to watch these young guys coming from different parts of Canada, and especially when you saw them in their tunics on November 11th, and the rest of the time they were working dress. And but for me, I was looking at what could I do. I had an option either to join the military, like a lot of Maritimers did. I could work. If I chose to, once I graduated from high school, I could work for the Bank of Montreal at, I think they were paying the grand sum of $22 a week in those days, and they were saying that you would be transferred here, there, and everywhere for the next 5-10 years. And we were getting the same story from the constables. If you join the Mounties, you can expect to move around. By the time fall of grade 12 came along, I had to make a decision, and we had professional days. They come in and they had people presenting from the military and the Navy, the Air Force, and the RCMP had a deal there. So 3 or 4 of us said, well, we should have a look at that. So I went over to the detachment and asked for some pamphlets and arranged to pass the exam. So 4 of us wrote the exam, and I'm the only one that passed. And I wasn't sure that that's what I wanted to do, but now that I was committed, I had to see it through, so I had the interview to go along. My buddies were all kidding me because they say the only reason you want to join the Mounties is because you want to keep wearing your scout hat. And it's kind of an interesting spot because I found out later on that Sam Steele was the one that kind of came up with that hat and passed it on to Baden-Powell, who then adopted that as the scout headdress. But it wasn't why I joined the force. I just wanted to get out of town, like a lot of Maritimers did. I did not want to work do seasonal work. Certainly didn't want to work for the bank. So down to July 2nd, 1965, my father drove me down to Fredericton, signed up, and I got a job the next day to translate a document from English to French. And then once everybody had a look at it, to retranslate the answer back to English so they'd know that they had done the right job. They took me to the train station and gave me a ticket with a berth, and away I went. My first stop, Montreal, where my uncle met me at the station there, and I stayed there overnight. The next day, back on the train, and hey, I was kind of popular. Who are you, and where are you coming from? Well, I'm from New Brunswick, and I'm going to be a Mountie. And I think it was 2 nights on the train. I got to Regina. So you got to remember, Grand Falls at that time was only about 2,500 strong. I got to the big city of Regina, and I think at that time there was about 25,000. It had more than one street light anyways, I knew that. And we went into training and walk into this big room, 32 guys from all over Canada, didn't know each other. There was 4 of us that spoke French, the rest were all English speaking. And we had everybody covered from BC to Newfoundland. I enjoyed training. I had, when I was a teenager, I was a Saturday night soldier. And I spent a couple of times during the civil defense of the day. We would go to training and the bases in New Brunswick. So training to me wasn't that difficult. I found some of it humorous, especially with hearing Harry Armstrong yelling at us, calling you a cream puff riding the back of a horse, or a few of the other instructors with some well-chosen words about where you came from. So training, I enjoyed training from start to finish. It was fun to meet the guys. We came in there and a little bit shy from school, a little unsure, skinny. I weighed 144 pounds when I joined the force. I had to breathe in twice before I even got the expansion required to get in. And I think at one point, I think I considered putting some nuts and bolts in my pocket to make sure I weighed enough to get in. So 144 pounds, I got in there. When I left training, it was 165 pounds. Still a skinny kid. And I got in front of the staffing officer. He said, "Well, young fellow, where do you want to go?" And by this time, I had looked around in the western provinces, and I was really impressed with that. All that farmland, all that flatness. You climb on a brick and you see another 5 miles. I thought I would like to stay in the prairies. I didn't know the northern part of the prairies was as hilly and forested as New Brunswick. But anyway, I sat down with the corporal and, "Where do you want to go?" I says, "Well, my 3 choices are Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Anywhere in the north, I don't care." That's exactly what we need. Corporal says, "You know," he says, "these young, you speak both languages. We need guys like you, and I'm pretty well guaranteed you're going to get one of those." So about a month, or was it about 2 weeks before we graduated, I got paraded and we got our postings. And I knew something was not going too well because the guys that were around me were getting postings that they weren't asked for. And there was some pretty sad faces. Then I heard my name, Al Rivard, and C Division. And I said, "Where the hell is C Division?" I guess I wasn't listening in class when they were giving the different letters. It was Montreal. I said, "You got to be kidding me." So 3 of us were posted to Montreal. So I decided to drive. I was one of the few guys in training that had a car, 1958 Pontiac. And we left Regina in 1966, February, in the middle of winter, and drove across Canada to Montreal. We got the car serviced as we went along. You know, we had the oil change in Manitoba and so on whenever we ran into trouble. And we drove in Montreal, and I had been in Montreal once. I had relatives there, my 3 uncles. So I came down Montreal, and we went to my uncle's place. And I was looking around, and I said, "Man, what did I let myself into?" But it wasn't all bad. I wanted to do contract policing. I wanted to be like the guys in Grand Falls, you know, the coaching basketball and doing that kind of stuff. And no, I wasn't going to get the luck of working contract policing. I was going to work in Montreal. Big job, too. First day, we 3 of us were paraded to the CO. I think it actually was Mike Sevier's father that received us in Montreal. So we lined at 3 in a row. We argued about who would walk in first and who would be the last. So we walked in, and the CO, I think, looked up once during his welcome speech and said, "You 2, you're going to stay in Montreal, and you're going to go to Quebec City." I was the first one, so I stayed in Montreal. Our job in those days, 66, this was during the silent revolution in Montreal. The mounted police wasn't in the most favorite people around in Montreal in those days. So we ended up guarding the building, walking around at night. All that, you know, the highlight of my career is trying to put in 8 hours and stay awake, especially when you're sitting in the garage with the lights out. And things were quite interesting. I think the highlight of that particular deal was the CEO came in one night and blew the horn. My memory had failed me. I opened the door and I said, "Why are you blowing the horn for?" And he said, "Well, I want to get in the garage." And, "Well, who are you?" I said, "I'm your CEO." I thought, okay, I better let him in. From Montreal, I went to Quebec City, finally, because there was labor unrest in Quebec City on the harbor. Stevedores had gone on strike. And that was fun, and that's where I started to learn from the senior constables and the corporals about the importance of what later became titled community-based policing. We didn't know that's what it was when we did it. We walked in and the corporal says, "Now these guys on the picket, that's Mike and that's Fred and he's from New Brunswick and he's from North Shore and that's how we kept the peace." We had probably 200 picketers outside of the Quebec harbor, and there was 4 of us keeping the peace. And somebody would come up and, "Hi, Fred, how's the wife? And, you know, what are you doing? What do you got in your lunch box?" We kept the peace that way. I don't think that there was any pushing, or it was a mutual respect. They knew what we were there for, and we knew what they were there for. So we stayed, we told them they couldn't go beyond a certain place, and they couldn't stop people from actually driving in, and they respected that. So this was the beginning of knowing what actually was community-based policing. Is if somebody is going to have a hard time, giving you a hard time, if you call him by first name, ask him about his wife and kids, and how the last thing, how the repairs on the car went. If you knew that part of it, then they had to be quasi your acquaintance, if not your friend. So we stayed in Quebec City for a little while, stayed in one of what they called the Polack homes. The RCMP in those days, they didn't build their own detachment, they just took over buildings nobody else wanted, I guess. So we ended up in this building. I lived in the basement. There was a big chandelier in the main office, and nobody had bothered to take it down. And so I started my career in Quebec City doing federal policing, migratory birds, and Small Vessels Act, and that kind of stuff. Transferred back to Montreal, and they said, "You're going to be on IDLS." Now, the transfers were very well thought out. The staff sergeant came in the GIS office and said, tomorrow you got to report to IDLS in Montreal. And he said, the papers they'll be in shortly. So then I had to borrow $5 to get gas in my car, because it had been sitting there since I'd been posted there, because I didn't have any money. You got to remember, I signed on at $3,900 a year. By the time I got to Quebec City, I was up to $4,150. I think that's what we got the raise. So I borrowed some money and drove back to Montreal. Went into the back room, or at the front desk, and we got you. You're in room such and such on the 3rd floor. I went into the office in the morning, in the IDLS office, and I said, "I'm the new kid." He said, "Well, who are you?" So I identified myself. I haven't heard about this. So I said, "Well, what am I going to do?" He said, "Well, sit and we'll find out." So after coffee, he comes back. Yeah, the papers came through yesterday. You're on that corporal's team. You're going to be doing surveillance. What's that? So for the next 3 years, learn about surveillance. And the days there we were doing both in Montreal. They called it IDLS because it was Inter-Directorate Liaison Squad. We would work as a surveillance team for both criminal and for CSIS. So if somebody was acting up and there was somebody that was part of the 𝑇ℎ𝑒 𝐹𝑟𝑖𝑒_ND𝑠, we would be assigned to do surveillance on this character until further notice. And we collect where he went and who he met, photographed if we could. And the next morning we'd be assigned to maybe an organized crime figure. So here I was, 21 years old, and I was working on some of the biggest criminals in Canada. Unbeknownst to me, really, but I got to know about Vic Catroni and all of the big crime figures. The Bonanno family would come up, the people from Toronto, the connections, and we knew these people to see them. We knew who their girlfriends were and their wives, where their kids were going to school, where they were eating, who they were meeting, and that was exciting. You're a kid. You're still barely out of high school, and you're working on Canada's organized crime. Even if the mayor of Montreal at that time officially said that there was no such thing, we knew the difference. 3 years we did that, went into GIS Montreal, and all this time, in the back of my mind was my original interview with a staffing officer. I want to work contract policing out west. Although I'm a maritimer, I want to, mind you, I did meet my wife when I was in training, so that might have had something to do with it. Joanne and I got married in '67. She came to join me in Montreal and went to work in the bank of CIBC. And, I was making $41.80. She was making $46 as a bank clerk. So there's the priorities of how things were decided in those days. But I still wanted to get out west. So I would, anytime I had a chance, I'd tell the staffing officer, any chance of getting back to contract policing out west. And I got my wish. In 1969, I was transferred. My daughter was 3 months old at the time. You're transferred west to Ottawa. So I arrived in Ottawa, and I worked here in Ottawa, GIS, just downtown here. I was the only French-speaking member on GIS. So the sergeant of the day says, you take that old Pontiac over there, and he says, you're going to have all the federal files on the Quebec side. So I would drive up across the river, go to the courthouse, get my papers done, and then drive every which way in western Quebec where the investigations took me. I did every federal statute there might be and carried on with this. I got involved in a bit into intelligence, so I went into NCIS, and again got back into organized crime, right here on Preston Street and other places, and on the Quebec side. Unfortunately, we pushed one team too hard in Quebec, and the CO of the day, or the OC of the day, heard through the grapevine that there had been a threat against RCMP members working on the Hull side. And rather than calling us and asking our opinion on it, the three of us were transferred to the Four Winds. One guy went to North Bay, one went to Sault Ste. Marie. And for me, wanting to go back to contract policing, I ended up in recruiting branch in headquarters. And there I was, 6 years service, and writing, responding to letters from young 14-year-olds from the US and Britain and Australia wanting to know more about the RCMP and how could they join. Quite frankly, that was kind of a low part of the career, is that you were reduced to recruiting branch, but I wasn't doing any recruiting. I was answering letters. So I I would bring this topic back up to staffing. How about a transfer? Somebody says, you better just do your work for a while, show what you're worth, and then maybe they'll consider it. So Dick Walling came in from the Maritimes, and he got appointed as a staffing officer. And so one day I got fed up with something that was going on. I walked into Mr. Walling's office and I said, I've been a good boy. I'm 18 months into this job and I don't really like it. I'd like to go to contract policing. He said, well, where do you want to go? I said, I don't care. You can send me to Saskatchewan for all I care. Just get me out of here. 3 weeks later, I was transferred to Regina, CO's discretion. 8-year service. I'd forgotten more about policing than I had learned, really. From training, things had totally changed. So when I got into Regina, I went to see the COO thinking I was going to get some interesting postings up in, you know, Prince Albert, someplace like that, where I could throw a line in the water once in a while. Or no, I ended up Regina Town Station in the old post office building on the 5th floor. And I was assigned to the detachment there. And quite frankly, I really enjoyed the contract. I wasn't disappointed. Get into the detachment, get out to the community, meet people, find out who they are, what their first names are, and talk to the kids. I had been a scout all through my teenage years, from age 12 to when I joined the force. So when I went back to detachment, I went back to the scouting movement as part of my extracurricular activity, thinking that that would be my way to get to the parents, into the communities. Some guys played hockey. I can't skate, so I did scouting. And man, that was a good time. I did detachment and highway patrol. I wasn't the biggest producer, but I wasn't the lowest either. But I knew everybody. And you remember on those days, from the graveyard shift at 11 o'clock till 7 in the morning, most of the night you were the only cop around for 50 miles. And the only way you survived is you talked a lot, and you made sure that you knew people, and you told telecoms where you were, and that was your survival skills. But it was a different time too. I think I've heard other people talk about what today's policing is and the policing in the 60s. Let's face it, the police in the 60s, I was running into kids that were like me when I was looking at the Mounties in Grand Falls. They were impressed with the uniform. And unless you did something that really disappointed them, they respected you. You could tell them, you have to move. An example was one night outside of Regina, I was driving down the highway and I see this big bonfire in the middle of a field. So I drove in there on my own. I found out it was the football team from Regina, the high school. So there's about 20 kids there and their girlfriends. And you know, a couple of beers, they get a little, and they're twice your size. So I walk in there and I said, whose farm is this? Well, it's so-and-so. Do you have permission to be here? Well, you know, we're just having a beer. And, but by the time you got to know some of them, you know, all of a sudden, oh yeah, you're so-and-so's kid. Or I think the best thing for you to do would be to put the fire out, take the beer, put it in the trunk, and then quietly leave. And the next time you should ask permission for someone, and you should let us know. And there you were by yourself. All these kids, they could have eaten you for breakfast. And yet, yes sir, they carried away. And a mouthpiece would start up and the girlfriend would go quiet. And away they'd go away. We'd go in the small towns, we'd go in the high schools, especially in places south of Regina. The weekends, the kids would get a little while and rip up the pavement. I remember going down there with somebody's camper and just sit in the camper and watch the cars go by and doing wheelies and so on. And the next morning going on the farm and knocking on the door and saying, you own a Chrysler, such and such a license number? Yeah. Why were you doing wheelies on Main Street last night? And the father would say, Herman, come in here. They would look after the police, and you didn't have to do too many, lay too many charges, or maybe once in a while a warning ticket. And I started working there with the natives. I had worked a bit in Quebec, out Caughnawaga, but once I got out west, well, north of Regina, there's 4 reserves right there. And the other thing was going into the band office and offering to play pool with the young natives for Pepsi. Well, I never won a pool game. Mind you, I was a pretty good pool shark in high school, but on the reserves, it was getting to know the kids, knowing them, and for them to at least have a rapport. So the next time they saw you, if they're sitting in the car and you say, "Oh, hi, how are you? How's Michael? How's your mom?" You could save yourself a lot of problems. One-man patrols in those days, you had to be a little smarter than the average bear. I was transferred out of Regina to Uranium City. Now, I was actually looking forward to that. But by the time they did that, Uranium City was starting to slow down. And they were talking about it was going to be downgraded from a staff sergeant to a sergeant's position, fewer, and I was still, by this time, I was still almost 10 years service. I was a constable going into a detachment where I would have been probably junior in service, because everybody had 15, 16 years service. So somebody decided to offer me a position at depot because of a vacancy that happened in February. And so the staffing officer calls me up and he says, "Well, we know we've got you on paper for Uranium City, but depot is opening up and it could be a corporal's position." And so I had to really think about that. It took about probably 2.5 seconds where I said, "Yeah, depot sounds like a pretty good deal."